Okay, so episode 3 of The Last of Us. This is my review of Long Time, and I'll just start this review with my overall thoughts, non-spoiler thoughts for anybody who hasn't watched it yet. Then I'll go kind of go through the episode and talk about some things that really stood out to me, and then at the end of the review, I'll compare the game to the show, and we'll look at some kind of comparisons. Being that I've been a player of the game a few times over now. So my initial thoughts on this episode was it was really well done. I mean, this is a very well done episode of television. Um, there might be some controversy surrounding this episode because of what it gets into, um, and that it's a departure from the game in a way. It shows more of this relationship between these two characters than was seen in the game. Really, we don't see these two characters, Bill and Frank, interact in the game. Um, but in this episode, there you do, so and even Craig Mason and Neil Druckmann in the Inside the Episode said this was probably the biggest departure from the game, but they did it for a good reason, and I agree. I mean, I think this was an excellent story. Great on character development, and it ties nicely in with Joel and Ellie in the beginning and the end of the episode. They kind of bookend this episode, where Bill and Frank take up their story takes up most of the runtime of this episode. So overall, I thought this was great. I thought it was very well done. Um, it's somewhere around a 9 out of 10 for me, maybe a 9.5. But I do want to get into some of the story points here, and we picked this episode up, shortly after episode 2 ends, where of course we saw Tess. And this is where I'm gonna get into some spoilers. So I guess this is your spoiler warning. If you haven't watched the episode yet, go back and watch it, then come back and watch this review. Um, so at the end of episode 2, Tess dies. She's bitten, she's infected, and she decides to go out with a bang, provide a distraction for Ellie and Joel to get out of there, and literally blows up the Capitol building. But here we are now. We're 10 miles west of Boston. Their journey is continuing, and it's just Joel and Ellie now, and they've got a battle with this conflict they have with each other because they haven't been off to a very good start. Their relationship is not off to a good start. Um, they're not seeing eye to eye here, but um, right in the beginning of this episode, Ellie kind of calls out the elephant in the room. She can feel that Joel is angry, maybe blaming her for the loss of Tess, for going on this whole mission. But Ellie calls him out on it, and she's like, "Listen, do not blame me for something that isn't my fault. This isn't my fault." Um, she calls him out on it. That's one thing I really loved about Ellie's character. She doesn't take any crap. She says it how it is. That's her character in the video game too. So, this is a faithful performance of that. And yeah, so I thought it was a good place to start here. Another thing I really liked about this episode was, they kind of searched this old gas station or convenience store type place for supplies. One of the major aspects of the game is finding supplies along the way, and that's a big part of it. Whether it's ammunition or medical supplies, you can craft things. You can craft med kits in the game. It's a really unique and cool part of the game. You can even upgrade your weapons at a tool bench. There's a lot of, and this was really reminiscent of that for me. So I enjoyed that. We also got some more backup or background information on how the cordyceps infection may be spread in the first place. And Joel's theory on it is that it probably mutated, cordyceps probably mutated and got into the food supply, maybe through flour or sugar, something common that a lot of people use. And this is interesting, and we can pretty much confirm this now because in episode 2, when the military officer was talking to the mycologist, she asked where the incident happened with this person that she was examining that got bit, and he said it was in a flour factory. And actually, the world's largest flour mill is in Jakarta, where this whole thing took place. So, we can probably now say with some certainty that's how this thing got spread. And we don't learn in the game, we don't learn a lot about the background of the virus and or the infection and how it was spread, this fungal infection. So I think it's cool to get back and to go back into some of that through these flashbacks and through characters dialogue and everything, and just see how it spread. So I like that. I enjoyed that. Joel and Ellie in this episode also come to this bone graveyard, and basically Joel tells Ellie that, and she's all about seeing it. She's like, I can handle it. I want to see this. And you have this graveyard basically of bones, and Fedra would actually kill uninfected people if they couldn't fit into the QZ zone, because Joel basically said, well, if they're dead, they can't get infected. So they're trying to do everything they can to stop the spread. Which included killing innocent people, if they couldn't fit into the quarantine zone. So that was a pretty harsh element of the story. Um, but then a big part of this episode flashes back and takes us through a journey. It takes us through a relationship, really. Um, from 2000, we stop in 2003, we go forward to 2007, 2013, and then to the present, 2023. So I really like this approach they took with telling Bill and Frank's story through all these years. So we see in 2003 that Bill, played by Nick Offerman, who was in Parks and Recreation, he is just outstanding in this role. He really felt like Bill to me from the video game. He's basically this doomsday prepper, and he's got loads of guns and supplies. He sets traps all around this town. Basically, what happened was, this was a place where Fedra cleared out, but he stayed, because he's a prepper. He was in his bunker, and he's got all these supplies. He's ready. He's setting traps all over the town. He grows food for himself. He raided all the town supplies, and he's basically built this up for himself. And the character of Frank, who's played by Murray Bartlett, who was in The White Lotus season 1, and I didn't even recognize him here. But he falls into one of the traps, and through some convincing, Bill basically takes him in, and we get this kind of, here we go. Here's Nick Offerman, in the image if you're watching this on YouTube, as Bill. And he's basically this doomsday prepper, and it really paid off in this situation. But again, this was let's see, here's the shot of Frank, who was just getting out of one of those traps that Bill set. And we get this really beautiful scene of them playing the piano, and Bill plays this song, Linda Ronstadt, long time. And it's kind of this really raw, really beautiful rendition. He's no musician or anything, and he admits that, but it just made for a really beautiful scene, I thought, in telling where his character is, with basically this, um, I guess, this story of love for him. So that's, something that audiences might fall on one side or the other about, because this is a bit of a detour from the game a little bit, because we actually see this relationship play out over time, where in the video game it just kind of alludes to the fact that Frank was Bill's partner. But here we get this story through time. So basically, how this connects to Tess and Joel, we get this kind of dinner date scene, because Frank is all about with trying to connect with other people, where Bill just doesn't want anybody to know about his town and everything. But they had this dinner date with Tess and Joel. Frank invites them, and they want to kind of help each other out, but Bill doesn't like this idea. And Joel warns Bill, though, that basically raiders he says, you seem pretty safe from the infected, and I don't think Fedra is going to come up here, but you could see raiders come to the town and everything. And he warns them of this, and that ends up, what basically happens, as we move to 2013, um, Frank decides to trade a gun for strawberry seeds, and he grows these strawberries and everything. And there's a scene of them eating these fresh strawberries, and they're really kind of in this whole like almost paradise type situation away from all this. But then it turns from what feels like a paradise into this horrific scene of the raiders attacking, and there's all Bill's traps are going off and people are being burned alive, and it's this whole thing. So I don't know if there's any connection between, Frank reaching out to the outside world and the raiders finding out about where they are, or if that would have happened either way. But it's an interesting thing to think about. um, and after the whole raid thing happens, Bill is shot in that process, and we think that he might die. But it seems like Frank saved his life, because 10 years later, it's 2023, and I have to say they aged a lot in 10 years. The amount they aged in these 10 years is like the amount that Obi-Wan Kenobi aged on Tatooine from Revenge of the Sith to A New Hope. But sadly, Frank has some type of degenerative disease. I thought maybe it was an MS type of thing or a Parkinson's type of thing. But Frank decides that he just wants to spend one more day with Bill. He doesn't want to go on living like this. So he just has this thing in his head of what he wants that last day to be like. He wants them to have a dinner together, and for them to get married. And at the end of the night, he wants Bill to basically drug his drink, so that he dies. Um, but what happens is, Bill kind of reveals to Frank that in the beginning of everything, he didn't like people. He didn't mind seeing the world burn down. And there were times when there was a scene in this episode where he even just sits back and watches the infected like get tripped up in his traps and everything. And he's like saying this never gets old. But it turns out that Frank became his purpose, and he wanted to protect Frank and take care of Frank and everything. And so if Frank dies, then Bill essentially dies inside because he loses his purpose. So he decides to um, take his own life as well, which, is, of course, another possible point of controversy in this episode. This decision they make to just end their lives. And but at the end of this episode, they leave a letter and a key for Joel that Ellie finds, and because Ellie and Joel in 2023, maybe a few months after Frank and Bill died, Ellie and Joel get to Bill's house, and they're searching it and everything, and they get a letter and a key written to Joel, and they kind of load up and stock up and everything. And the key, of course, is to a truck. So now they have a vehicle. They have a working vehicle. But the letter was very poignant, and I think the letter is really a key for Joel and maybe what he needed to push him to protect Ellie. Because in the letter, Bill basically says he hated the world, but he found one person worth saving. And I think that's what Joel is going to do here. He basically hates what's going on in the world. He's failed to save his daughter. He failed to save and protect Tess. I mean, even the letter, it talks about all these supplies being for him to protect Tess, but he failed to do that. So now Ellie is the only one. Ellie is the one who is alive that he can save and protect. And I think this event is really going to push that forward. So Joel and Ellie at the end of the episode basically stock up, and they're heading west in the truck. So I want to talk about some of the differences between the game and show, and even some similarities, just some comparisons between the game and the show this week. So one of the things that was very similar with the show and the game is the trip wire that Bill set up. He set up these different traps around the town. The trip wire traps are very similar in the game and the show, so that was cool seeing that. The second thing, Ellie finds an arcade game in both the game and the show in this episode. In the game, the arcade game is called The Turning, which I think kind of alludes to like zombie type things. But in this show, it's actually Mortal Kombat 2. That is the arcade game she finds. And Another thing here in the game, I mentioned this earlier, we don't actually see Frank and Bill as alive when Joel and Ellie come through Bill's town. But in the show, they're both dead by the time Joel and Ellie get there. So that's again, one of the major departures. And finally, Joel gives Ellie 3 rules before they leave Bill's in the game and in the show, and they're identical. The 3 rules are: number 1, don't bring up Tess for any reason. Number 2, don't tell anyone. He tells Ellie, don't tell anyone about your condition because they won't understand. And if they see that bite, they're basically going to shoot you. And the third rule is do what I say when I say it. So it's cool to like look at these comparisons and see what they kept exactly the same, what they kept similar, and where they deviated and departed from the show. But overall, again, I really thought this episode was very well done on a character development level, on a story level, on just the moments and the emotions that were created in this episode. Overall, I really enjoyed it for what it is, and I think the show continues to impress, and I can't wait until next week's episode. But what did you guys think of The Last of Us this week? Was there anything that happened that was a deal breaker for you, that because it departed too much, or for whatever reason, or did you think this show just continued to be stellar and outstanding with this week's episode? Let me know in the comments section. I look forward to hearing from you, and stay tuned for next week's review of episode 4.